I know there's a lot of unrest and people being killed, so that's about it.
I just know there's warring factions over there, and it's trying to work out who's really running the country at the moment, and no one seems to know.
And the war in Syria at the moment is a bit of an uprising from within Syria to demonstrate their lack of satisfaction with their government.
What I understand about Syria at the moment is that it is as close to a civil war as what you can get in a country.
Yeah, Syria's had a dictatorship for, I don't know, just about forever, I imagine.
Basically a civil war. It sort of came from the Arab Spring uprising, and unlike some of the other countries, hasn't resolved. I think it's appalling that there's no intervention.
I think NATO bombing their country is wrong. That's why we have the United Nations to sort these things out, and hopefully it'll work, not just NATO.
Strategic bombing, I think, could be a benefit, but
there's always too many civilian casualties.
Yeah, and I don't think Europe's got the resources themselves at the moment to do that.
And it hasn't resolved anything
anywhere
else, so why continue that way of dealing with problems?
No, I don't. The trouble with NATO is that the UN can't get together and send a peacekeeping force in, but NATO can go there and drop a few bombs on there just to aid one side or the other. I don't really think it's been demonstrated too well from either Afghanistan or Iraq that they do a particularly good job and they just drop bombs in places without really being 100% sure what's going on there.
I don't know, I'm sure there's some sort of peaceful solution, but I don't know what that is. Bombing's never going to help anything, so yeah. I'm all for peace.
I don't trust the Middle Eastern government in that region anyway. A lot of the time, especially when you see that they're claiming that the militants are causing atrocities, and then you hear the White House saying that there's no proof to back that up and back and forth. So I think the government seems to be saying a lot of information that's just wrong, but I don't think either side will really tell the truth in situations like that, because there's bound to be a lot of crossfire and civilians caught in the middle either way.
You've just got to try and get as much information as you can through reading as much varied newspapers online as you can, and try and make an assessment based on your own reading.
I have to go to Syria and visit someone living there. You might get a straight answer.
Unless you're there, you don't really know what's going on, so just get what the media tells you. So
yeah, it's really hard to say from over here because you're just pretty much stuck with whatever you see on the generic media.
My name's Brian Polar. I've been requested to chair this evening's monthly argument, which is, should there be military intervention in Syria? Each speaker will have about 4 or 5 minutes to outline a position.
My claim in relation to Syria is that we're at the point where regime change of some sort is necessary if Syria is to avoid going down further into the spiral of violence that it's already in. As I said in Crikey last week, when bloodshed on this scale is happening in a country, something is badly wrong with its government and things need to change sooner rather than later. And I think that's the case even if you believe that the opposition in Syria is just as morally blameworthy or just as culpable in the present situation as the regime. I personally don't believe that, but even if you do, it doesn't change the situation that we're in a place where things are not going to get better unless there is a serious move to democratization. And I mention that because whenever I write about the subject, I get comments from people who say, "Look, you're just you're a tool of Western imperialism. You've been conned by the mass media. Dr. Assad is a perfectly nice chap, and everything would be fine if the West would just stop arming the terrorists." And the thing is, I agree with some of the premises of that argument. I don't believe you should believe everything that you read in the media. I don't believe you should believe everything the United States government tells you. But this is not Iraq, you know. This is not a situation where a country was stable until something intervened from outside. This is a movement across the region where people within individual countries have made the move themselves to demand democracy, to demand human rights, to demand participation in government. And whatever you think of the rights and wrongs of the individuals involved, it seems clear that those movements are not going to go away if we in the West stop talking about them. So, question is, what do we do about it? What can be done? No surprise probably to you to hear that I think Russia is the key. Both because of its direct influence in Syria, as the regime's one major ally in the region, but also, of course, because Russia has veto power in the UN Security Council, and as a good internationalist, I believe that the maximum possible international consensus is necessary before you can justify intervening in this sort of situation. So I think it's in Russia's own interests to cooperate and to try to organize, try to usher in as quick and peaceful a transition in Syria as can possibly be arranged. It's not as if Russia has a personal stake in the current regime. It doesn't. What Russia wants is for its own geopolitical interests to be protected and for its own prestige not to be harmed. As it's no great power likes to be seen to be pulling the rug from under an ally. So Russian feelings need to be met in that regard. What can the West do? Firstly, Western countries should be working as much as possible with Russia, trying to allay Russian fears and trying to secure Russian cooperation. Secondly, we should also, and that extends to just ordinary people in Australia, we should be doing everything we can to raise awareness of the issue, try and convey to the world community that what's going on is unacceptable and change needs to happen. And failing everything, at some point the West may need to consider whether a sufficient consensus exists for intervention even without Russia.
It might be an appropriate time to introduce now Mr. Arthur Dent.
As soon as you start discussing Syria, you will find the arguments in favour of the Assad regime are exactly the same as the arguments in favour of the Egyptian regime. And the fears are the same. The fear is that in Egypt, the result inevitably will be that the Sunni majority, overwhelming majority in Egypt, will make it a far more Islamic country, a far less tolerant country in many respects. The Christians are feeling less secure in Egypt now than they were before. Well, and all of that has some real truth to it. But the simple fact is that it got that bad, it got that sectarian because of this autocratic regime saying we're the only way, we're the only people who can run a civilized government in a country like Egypt. It's just so backward that the Fellaheen just are not capable of governing themselves. It has to be an elite like us has to run it. And that's the message we're getting from Assad. It's the message we're getting from the apologists and supporters of the regime. In Syria, there are real reasons for concern. The Saudis have been arming jihadi terrorists. There are jihadi terrorists in Syria now, and the Saudis are providing most of the military backing for the opposition. The longer that goes on, the more sectarian the conflict will be. The more the chance there will be that the Alawites and Christians and so on, other minorities in Syria will end up being really oppressed. If we don't want that to happen, then we need to intervene quickly. Now that is one point where I disagree strongly with Charles, is all this excuses about Russia. He says that the critical factor is whether Russia will support it or not. I think that's just fantasy from listening to Western propaganda, right? And that's another thing that I will agree with the people on the other side of the debate, that we get an awful lot of Western propaganda, right? But most of what we read about Syria and so on is totally slanted. Al Jazeera went absolutely overboard with the Egyptian revolution, and they managed to top themselves over Syria, right? But there's no question of impartial reporting and so on. They're clearly out to get rid of the regime. But part of the Western propaganda is, oh, the reason we're not intervening is because of Russia. And you only have to think about that for about 30 seconds for it to be just obviously silly. You know, it's not as though Russia's got some military force that they would be threatening to intervene. China is also voting against it. It really doesn't make much difference. What matters is that whereas in Libya it was comparatively cheap and easy for the West to intervene, it's just a long coastal strip, and you could use NATO bombing to make a difference in the war, and even then it took more than 6 months before the regime collapsed. Syria has got a serious army, it's got serious, I'm not trying to make a pun, but Syria is not as tin-pot a regime as Libya. They've got an air defence system, they've got an army that can fight. An intervention will be a much more expensive and difficult activity, and the results will be that the countries that intervene will have to take some responsibility for it, and they'll be stuck with another costly thing. So they don't want to do it. But the longer they delay doing it, the worse the conflict will be. And I agree totally with what Charles said, that once you've got to a situation that they're in now, that government has to go. And I genuinely don't understand how anyone can, and I've spoken to people just today, saying they're confident that the Assad regime will survive. It just seems to me to be obvious that once the regime has to resort to tanks and helicopter gunships and even naval bombardment of their own cities, that regime cannot remain in power. And you can talk about this idyllic Syrian society and how it's not sectarian and so on. That's over. The regime has already engaged in an armed struggle against its own people. Such regimes cannot persist for long in this century.